Welcome to the Single Friendly Church podcast, brought to you by Single Friendly Church Network, a UK charity encouraging churches to welcome and value single people at every stage of life. Welcome to the Single Friendly Church podcast. My name's Beth. I'm from Single Friendly Church Network, and you're listening to our series exploring friendship. And today our guest is Phil Knox, who is an evangelist and missiologist at the Evangelical Alliance. He's passionate about making Jesus known and the power of friendship. He's also an award-winning poet and author of 2 books, including one on friendship called The Best of Friends, which we'll be asking him more about today. So welcome to the podcast, Phil.
Hey, Beth. So brilliant to be with you, and great to be talking about friendship.
Amazing. It's so good to have you join us. And as a side note, when I was looking at your bio for today, I actually noticed that you say you're an enthusiastic water skier. And I just wondered if that was a long-term hobby, if that was something more recent.
Yeah, I deliberately put enthusiastic rather than gifted because I love whizzing around, frequently fall in, and have no desire to kind of develop onto the fancy one ski. There are some people who kind of glide on the one ski. I just like going 2 skis, trying tricks and throw myself around, and I love it.
Amazing. Well, I'm sure you're much better than I would ever be. But we're not going to be talking about water skiing today. We're going to be talking about friendship. And it's so great to have you talking with us about this subject. We're going to be talking about what it means for us as Christians and the church, and also for those who are single as well. So I wondered if we could start with your story and how you've connected with this topic of friendship. I know you're really passionate about the power of it. And I just wondered if this is something that you've always been passionate about, or was there an experience you had that drove you to think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've always loved being a friend and having friends. But I think for me, actually, the real passion for it came out of a place of real pain. So like many people listening, I had a really terrible pandemic. So I'm an author, as you mentioned, and the first thing that happened is my first book was published in March 2020, which, as you will recall, was the week all the bookshops closed because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But at the same time, far more tragically, my mum, who'd been battling with cancer, we found out the cancer was terminal. And so I spent the first few months of lockdown sat at the end of her driveway each day, watching her physically deteriorate. It was a really, really hard season. And then she eventually died and went to be with Jesus on the 8th of June, 2020. But I remember throughout that, probably the hardest season of my life, wanting and needing people to be around me. But it was at a time when all the restrictions were in place in terms of social distancing. And so I vividly remember just prayer walking one morning and feeling the Lord encourage me to write and speak about friendship. It was basically 2 things that got me through that really difficult season: faith in Jesus and friendship. And so I've been determined ever since, really, to raise the volume on this. What I see as really being kind of the most important, least talked about relationship in the world and the church. And so that's where that kind of came from.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we find at Single Friendly Church that, the conversation in churches, but also just generally in the world, is a lot about kind of marriage and romance. And so friendship is really the relationship that's often overlooked. But as you say, it is so fundamental to all of us.
Yeah, totally. When I was researching the book, I could find, as you say, people who they do whole series on relationships. And you have like marriage and leadership and parenting covered, but nothing on friendship. And gladly, actually, I found the church have actually raised the volume a little, but there's still a long way to go.
When you were in that moment, when you realised that you needed friends so much when you're going through a hard time, I just wondered how, obviously in the pandemic, it will look very different to how it would look now, but how did your friends show up for you and support you in that moment?
Do you know what? It was genuinely amazing, Beth. I look back now and really quite moved just thinking about it, actually, where our kitchen looked like Clinton's cards. Our living room looked like a florist. We were just so loved. We didn't cook a meal for like 3 months because people just kept bringing food round. I remember people actually as well who you'd have sometimes maybe more superficial friendship with, or kind of more distant friendship. And they turn up and just say, "Would you like to go for a walk and talk?" And there were just lots and lots of people like that. One friend just came around having made me the biggest cookie I'd ever seen in my life.
Amazing.
It's just what I needed that day. And I just really remember that. And it was I think sometimes people say in times of grief, if there's anything I can do. And I think my advice is sometimes just people grieving often don't know what to do, don't know what they need. So just doing something. I certainly didn't request a massive cookie, but that friend thought, this is my expression of love and friendship, and it made a huge difference.
Absolutely. I think the power of baked goods is really underestimated.
Oh, man.
Having experienced how your friends showed up for you, did that help you become a better friend to other people as well, having kind of been on the receiving end of that?
Yeah, do you know, it's one of those things, isn't it? Well, I think the Bible talks about as we've been comforted, we are able to then comfort others. And I think it gives you a new level of empathy with those. And I think you also begin to understand about how you want people to be with you. So I remember, again, it's kind of similar example, really. I remember when my best friend, his dad died. And because of my experience going through grief, actually, I knew that the best thing he did for me in my grief was just sitting with me. I think that's what I tried to do in terms of that kind of reciprocal moment. And I think we learn, I think, through sometimes our own experiences, how we can be really good friends to those who, when they go through them. And so I hope so. But I think also you become aware, once you've been through a real period of trauma, quite how often other people go through that too. And I think you see things in a way that you wouldn't had you not been through that yourself.
Yeah, it's kind of, you can see what your friends need and how you can show up for them in that moment. I guess it's things like listening. Sometimes we don't really know how to listen as a friend until we feel like perhaps we haven't been listened to. It's interesting. So just thinking about the topic of friendship, obviously one of the first things that's obvious to talk about is why we have to talk about it in the first place. I know we touched a bit on how friendship is a bit underlooked, and obviously why you felt it was even necessary to write a book about it in the first place. We spoke to Sheridan Voicey recently about how we're in something of a friendship recession, and I know that this is something that you talk about as well. So I'm just curious to hear from your perspective. You say there's lots of things that modern life puts pressure on friendship, but if you could pick one thing that you feel really stops us from forming great friendships, what would it be?
Yeah, I mean, there's loads on. I think there's busyness and mobility. I know Sheridan really well. He's become a really good friend, actually. And actually, we've talked about this. I would say one really undervalued thing is the way that our type of work has changed. And by that, I mean that about 41% of us in the UK are what's called knowledge workers, which means we think for a living. I'm guessing that many people listening, and you, Beth, are primarily, we use our brains at work. And I think the challenge with that is sometimes we use our brains for the same things at work as we use to make friendships. In fact, a lot of our jobs are highly relational. And what that means is we expend a lot of our relational energy and our thinking energy at work, which means that when we get home, we are just good for nothing, it feels like, than to just kind of sit on the sofa and kind of, slob in front of our phones or the TV. And I think that's a relatively new phenomenon in our world. When we think about kind of 100 years or so ago, primarily more people used their bodies for work rather than their brains. So I experienced this a lot with my best mate, who is a builder, and he digs a lot of work. He thinks a bit, but he also digs an awful lot. But when it gets to 5 o'clock, he is ready for friendship. He's been using his body far more than his brain, whereas I think, probably use my brain more than I use my body at work. And so I'm often in the red when it comes to those kind of relational muscles. And I think that trend has kind of snuck up on us a little, which I think is a real threat, because I think we get to our evenings when it's friendship time or the weekends, and we sometimes lack that emotional resilience and capacity to be able to give to one another.
Oh, that's really interesting. I've never thought about that before. I think we also just are being asked to work a lot more as well. There are a lot more demands on work, and it's like you can never really switch off even when you're at home, which I guess kind of adds to that sense of exhaustion.
Certainly, and I think also more of us are working. The average people in a household who are working has gone up significantly over the last few years, and so there's less give for friendship.
That's interesting. Let's talk more about your book. So it's called The Best of Friends, and the tagline is choose wisely, care well. And there's obviously so much really good and practical wisdom in this book. But one thing that really resonated with me on the kind of choose wisely front was that you said we can't be friends with everyone. And that's both good news and that's bad news. And when I read that, definitely there was a reaction in me. I felt simultaneously relieved, but also sad at the same time. And I just wondered if you could explain a little bit more what you mean by that.
Yeah, there you go. The relief and the joy and this kind of the sadness encapsulates the good and bad news, I think, Beth. So, first of all, the bad news is I think we live in a world that tells us we can have it all. And the challenge is when it comes to friendship, we just can't. We just have a limited relational bandwidth and capacity for relationship to be able to give to other people. That is the bad news. The good news is the relief, I think, is the right word, because I think this takes the pressure off. I think many of us really struggle with the fact that there are so many relationships to maintain. There's so many, WhatsApp messages to respond to. And when we scroll down our Facebook walls, we get overwhelmed with the number of people we're connected with who we haven't caught up with in ages. And I think just an honest moment for us all to say, we can't be great friends with everyone, but also we just can't maintain the levels of connection. People who say they've got 2,000 friends on Facebook, I don't think that's physically possible. So I wrote those words to give people permission to say, actually, it's okay, not a cruel way to kind of limit the capacity we have, but also just be honest, to be kind to ourselves and say it's impossible to maintain high quality relationship with everybody.
Yeah, I think that is definitely a relief to hear, especially when, as you say, you might go on social media and look at the amount of people you are kind of brackets friends with or people you're following. How many people do you think we can actually be friends with physically?
Well, there is some science here, Beth, as you might recall from the book. So the kind of upper limit scientifically, they reckon, is about 150. Now, if you're listening to this and you think, flipping, 150, don't worry, that's the kind of upper limit. But anthropologists, scientists recognize that's the kind of the capacity we have for a meaningful friendship, the kind of people we would bump into, be able to have a conversation, know where we stand in relation to one another. That's the kind of upper limit. And then in terms of kind of qualities of relationship, what I talk about in the book is that there's kind of a slightly smaller circle around about 12. So again, good science talks about 12 being about, you can be good friends with about 12, and you can be great friends with about 3 people. Now, again, it's not a hard and fast rule. You can't say, well, I've got my 12. That means I can't possibly be good friends with anybody else. But what's interesting when you look at those numbers is, I think, when you look at the life of Jesus, you think 21st century science seems to be telling us something that Jesus looks like he knew when he structured the way that he did his friendships. That you've kind of got this 150 limit, but then you've got the 12 and the 3. And so Jesus famously had these 12 disciples, leading some commentators to say that Jesus' greatest miracle wasn't the feeding of the 5,000, it was having 12 close friends in his 30s. But this kind of model of the 12 is kind of, he had 12 good friends and he chose to call them friends. But then he also had, which there's a few awkward moments in the Gospels where Jesus kind of says to 9 of his disciples, boys, you wait there. And he says to 3 of them in particular, Peter, James and John, you come with me. And it can seem really awkward, but what I think it demonstrates this really key principle, that there are a few people who we can have a particular level of depth of friendship with that we can't have with everybody else. And so that kind of that those moments of being really vulnerable, those moments of sharing the depths of our heart, can only be done with a few. And I think Jesus models that by having the 12, but then also having the 3. Love the quote by a guy called Rob Parsons, who says that if you want acquaintances, tell them your successes. But if you want friends, tell them your successes, your failures, your fears, your hopes and your dreams. And it seems to me that for Jesus, he had this inner circle of 3 who he shared absolutely everything with. And I think for me, that's been quite a good rule of thumb. I've got a few people who I don't share everything with everybody, but there are some people who I am really open with, really honest with, and who I need, and I hope that relationship is reciprocal.
Yeah, that's so true. Exactly. The 12 disciples and then obviously his inner circle as well. It's interesting how it's really helpful and practical, but you can also see that there's a biblical thread through it as well. And you can see that friendship was obviously really important to Jesus as well. He clearly put himself in community of friends and support, particularly as a single man.
Yeah, and fascinating that Jesus calls his disciples friends. And I think sometimes in our kind of 21st century lens through which we see our relationship with God, we don't realize the significance of that statement. So there's no other record in the first century of any other rabbi calling their disciples friends. When Jesus said this to the disciples, they'd have been like, what? Say that again, Jesus? You called us what? Because there was kind of relational distance between teachers and pupils, rabbis and disciples. For Jesus to call his disciples friends is just crazy in lots of ways. But I think it's really important because I think it's a really important lens through which we can see our relationship with God. And what a beautiful thing to know that the hands that flung stars into the universe reach out to us in friendship. I think that's an incredible joy and wonder.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Jesus calls us friends as well. And that's such good news. So thinking more about how church fits into this, I know you talked about that kind of circle diagram. I just wonder where church community fits in that. Would you say that being in a church community, everyone's your friend, or is there a bit of a difference between friendship and community?
Yes, probably. It depends on the size of your church, first of all. If you're in a kind of small house church, you can be really good friends with everybody. I think the reality is most of us are probably have a varying levels of churches. I preach in a different church almost every Sunday, and sometimes it's handfuls, sometimes it's hundreds, sometimes it's thousands. But when it comes to church, you kind of inevitably or hopefully have both those inner circle of close relationships and then a kind of outer circles of many kind of connections within church. And what I'd say is, I think it's not either or, but it is both and. What you can't have is kind of 50 close friends. But I think in Christian community, if it's less than 150, you can be friends with everyone. And I think in Christian community, we can and should get to know lots of people, some of whom we will have lots in common with, and some of whom will be completely different from. And that's a really good thing. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things about being part of a church.
Yeah, absolutely. Just thinking about community, I think what you said, it's really important and good to invest in that church community. And we were really struck by actually the new piece of research that the Evangelical Alliance, who you work for, has just published, which is the Finding Jesus report, a report about how and why people are turning to Jesus right now. And something that was really encouraging for us on this topic of friendship was that lots of people said that attending church had a significant impact on their journey to faith, not just because it was a nice service, but because they felt really welcomed and they felt the kindness of the Christian community. Could you talk a bit more into that, about how significant that is? And was that encouraging for you to find out?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just one factor. It is the single biggest factor. Once people are interested, the single biggest factor that helps them get to know Jesus and make a decision to follow him is going to church in person. Now, there's loads of encouraging things about that. First of all, it's in person. So I think being present and embodied with people is really, really important. Online church is great for lots of things. It's not so good at that real get to know people in a really tangible way. That's the first thing. I think the second thing is that all the way through, there are themes of hospitality and generosity. When it comes to what prompts people to begin exploring the Christian faith, there's this huge theme about people seeing the impact of faith on someone they knew, a Christian talking to them about their faith. Christians are doing a really good job at helping not yet Christians begin to think about faith, be good church, see people seeing community on the way and helping people to make decisions. And then the final thing on the friendship piece, specifically in Finding Jesus, is we asked people who become Christians who helped them most along the journey. And if you're a church leader and listening to this, the really good news for us is that we've got jobs because 23% of people said it was a church leader who helped them on the journey, but everybody else wasn't a quote unquote professional Christian. It was close friends, small groups of Christians, note the kind of community aspect there, people from church who weren't the leader, and family members, which means if you're listening to this and you've got not yet Christian friends, you will probably statistically be the most significant person on that journey. And that's one of the reasons why friendship matters so much, because we play such a significant part in people coming to know Jesus.
It's interesting to see statistically how perhaps just someone modeling just a life of faith and a life of kindness and friendship to someone can really cause them to look for something more.
Yeah, well, the reality is if we're really close to someone, we see more and more of their life, don't we? My late mum was a maths teacher. She'd be very proud of me because I'm going to use a mathematical term, a Venn diagram. When circles collide in a Venn diagram, it's a bit like the better we get to know someone, it's like their circle intersects with ours. We share our lives together in a way where our circles intersect. And if we know Jesus, the more they see of our life, the more hopefully they see of Jesus. But also the more we get to know them, the more we understand where God might fit into their life. So we get better at joining the dots between their story and God's story. And so I think Christians should be the best friends in the world. We've got the relational God who lives within us. So therefore, hopefully when people see us and see more of our lives, they see more and more of the Holy Spirit at work in us. And we're really excited by that.
Yeah, and it sounds like that's what people are seeing when they come to church and they're experiencing that Christian community. And I guess perhaps they're not finding it so much in society. So do you think that church has a really big part to play in terms of, we are part of the answer to this friendship recession in society?
Yeah, I think we model something really different. And I don't know what you think, Beth. I think the world is more fractured, I think, than it's ever been. And I think the darker the darkness, the brighter the light. And I think we hopefully model something different in a polarized and fractured world. There's lots of different ways in which church is beautiful across age and ethnicity and story and background. Let's just take political views. You could look at social media for 3 seconds to know that there is just division in our world in that area. And in my church where I live, we've got those who would lean quite left politically and those who would lean quite right politically. And the beautiful thing about church is those identities bow at the foot of the cross, because our primary identity is not as a political supporter, it's as a follower of Jesus. And what that means is that we can be friends. Right? So even in the disciples, there were those who would have lent politically right and politically left. Just look at Simon the Zealot and Matthew the tax collector. They become friends because their relationship with Jesus is most important. And I think in a society which is struggling with friendship, we are the antidote to a broken or fractured world when we can be friends despite our differences. So I think that's that. I think the world we live in is really individualistic. I think we can model something about sacrificial friendship, which I think is beautiful and draws people to church. So for both of those reasons, I think it's a really compelling time to model friendship to a world that's lonely.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you said about the diversity of Christian community being so beautiful, I think is just so key. And I think that's something that we see a lot as single-friendly church, that single people, they don't want to be in a church with everyone who's just like them. They want to be in a multi-generational church. They want to be around, perhaps if they don't have children, they want to be around families. They want to be involved in family life. They want to be friends with people older and younger than them. And that is just part of, just the beauty of the body of Christ. I guess I wonder, sometimes we hear from single people that they sometimes feel that there is a bit of a divide in the church. Obviously, we do want as much as possible to be this united body of Christ, but sometimes naturally we do tend to hang out with people who are perhaps a little bit more like us. So sometimes we do see that families might hang out with families and single people will hang out with single people. Is this something that you've noticed in church?
Yeah, totally. And to be honest, Beth, I see it myself as well. I think all of us probably do. There's that moment, isn't it? Whatever the last thing is, we all have a choice. Coffee is served. The leader says, go and get some coffee. We have a choice. I have a choice in that moment. At my worst, I gravitate towards the people who are like me, who I can have a really safe conversation with, who I can talk about the football that happened yesterday. And at my worst, those are the only people I talk to after church on Sunday. But at my best, I will look around and see who needs a conversation, who needs a hug, and who's different from me. And I will make the effort. And do you know what? It's less comfortable. There's a cost there. It's inconvenient to me. And you can choose, you can position yourself in the coffee queue. You can choose to walk up into a circle of people who are different from you. And I think at my best, I kind of step across the room into those spaces. Then I think the other thing that I've seen works really well is practicing hospitality liberally and inviting people who are different from you, who again are not the safe bet when it comes to who you have around. I think I used the example in the book of my wife basically writing a list of every single person in our church, and over a year making sure every single person came round for lunch on a Sunday. She deliberately introduced people to people who were different from her. That has been transformational for our church family. But I think the more we can do that and be intentional is a key word in friendship. Be intentional about gathering with people who are different from us and looking out for those who might be struggling. I think all of that plays its part in making a difference and being the antidote to the divided world in which we find ourselves.
Yeah, that's great. That's really refreshing to hear. I think sometimes we hear stories of perhaps single people who feel on the edge of church and see that social life and that hospitality that you talked about going on in specific groups in the church. And perhaps the single person might invite their single friends around for dinner, and married couples might automatically think about another married couple. So it's really great to hear practically, how can we naturally break out of that? Let's think intentionally, who haven't we had over for dinner? Or just thinking after the service, like you said, is it a good day? Let's go and speak to people. Let's go and kind of break out of that. You say that it sometimes can be uncomfortable to form friendships across difference, and I think I can completely agree with that. But sometimes those friendships, obviously, as you say, can have a real impact on us as well. I'm just wondering if there is a friendship in your life that you've had with someone who's very different to you. It could be in church, it could be outside of church, but that's had an impact on you.
Yeah, there's loads. I think there's something beautiful, isn't there, about the richness and diversity of the way God's made us. And I think sometimes for me, if I think about those kind of friendships, it's where I've needed people in my life where there's almost been a hole. And so for me, I think about someone like my friend Les, who is older. He's from a different cultural background. And a key moment in my life, as I mentioned, is when my dad died. So I was 21 when my dad died. I have not had a kind of physical father for more of my life than less of it. And so what I have needed in those spaces is older friends to help me and male role models. And what I'd say is it's not been mentoring with Les, it's been friendship. And so we've just kind of hung out, and I've been incredibly blessed by his wisdom and by his encouragement. And for people who, I think, especially when you've lost parents, people to say that they're proud of you, all those have just been so significant. And so I'm indebted to Les and other male role models who are a generation above me. And I think especially where there's an intercultural friendship, as in that case, and an intergenerational one as well, we need the richness of those. But, I think we're better in the church than in most spaces around that. When I was a student, the only people I saw, babies and old people, was when I went to church. I think about my own church family. There are Nigerians and Polish people and Ghanaian, Ukrainians. We've got a huge diversity of people from different nations. And they add a richness to my life that wouldn't be there if I didn't have the opportunity to spend time with them in the way that I do.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that idea about having a friendship with someone who's older than you, that really can speak so much into your life and you can learn so much from them. If there's someone listening here who would really like that and they feel like they don't, or perhaps all of their friends are a similar age, or they're not close to someone who's older in the church, do you have any advice about how they would perhaps go about finding an older kind of spiritual parent?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, find someone you want to be like. I hope there are people in your church who you look up to and say, do you know what, I quite like to be like you when I'm when I'm a bit older. And over time, you might get to the point where you're able to say that to them. I think what I would also say is that sometimes we have to take the first step, and that can be really daunting. And I think my first encouragement would be is to find a really non-threatening environment to hang out. So that might be inviting them round for food. That might be, if it's appropriate, inviting yourself round for food, or going to have a coffee, or finding a kind of thing to do together that there's a common shared interest. But I think what I would say is relationships like that, especially where there's difference, don't just happen. I think the challenge is most of us think friendship happens to us by accident, and I really don't think it does. And I think when it comes to different friendship across cultures or ages, sometimes we have to be even more intentional because it's less natural. But what I would say is it's really worth it, but be prepared for some bumps along the way. And sometimes the dance of friendship is sometimes we have to try a few times with people before we find something that clicks. And there can often be pain in that because we can get knocked back. And sometimes friendships have a glass ceiling, and that could be really hard. But it's worth it. It's keeping on going, because it's when you find those people, it really is special.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes there's also that friendship dance when it comes to friendship between those who are single and those who are married as well, because
Sure.
you have different priorities and different kind of things going on in your life. If you're single, perhaps, you're the only person who's paying the bills, right? So you have a lot of things to think about in that respect. But if you're
Yeah.
married, perhaps if you have children, you're also trying to balance those parental opportunities. Do you think that can also be a little bit difficult?
Totally. And I think for those who are married, making sure that they don't exclude people, even with the activities that they do, and kind of, if you only hang out with families, again, you're also depriving yourself of the richness of the diversity of friendship as well. And so I think on both sides, we need to I think the key word is there being intentional. There was a moment where, again, in our church, a really sobering lesson for us. There was a WhatsApp group, which when a couple got married, they got then invited into the WhatsApp group. And it was like, why on earth weren't they part of that WhatsApp group as single people? It was, looking back, you were like, what on earth were we doing? And so actually since then, there's been single people who've been invited into that. And I think some of it is just being aware of the dynamics we're creating, but constantly being intentional. But that should also be the distinctive of Christian friendship, where we're not looking out for our own interests, as Paul says in Philippians, but for the interests of others.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that thing of awareness is so key, isn't it? I think sometimes if you are single, sometimes you're more aware of your need for friends because unless you live with your best friends, you don't automatically have a social life for you waiting at home. You know, like perhaps you live by yourself or perhaps you live with housemates who you have less of a close relationship with. Whereas
Yeah.
if you're married, you know, you have your spouse, you know, you have your children, you're being fed a little bit relationally. Do you have any advice for someone who is single, who has a friendship with someone who is married with children, who feels like there is a bit of distance?
I think vulnerability and honesty is really key. And as that friendship develops, I think getting to a point where we just name some of the challenges. I think there's a lot of stuff with friendship that kind of is subtly implicit, but becomes a lot easier when it's stated. For both sides to be really honest about what's helpful and what's not helpful in terms of the ways to hang out. And so for single people to say, when you only talk about your friends who are married and other friends who have families, that's really unhelpful. I think even just being explicit about that can really help. But equally on the other side, just those honesty and vulnerable conversations. I think one of the challenges across the board with friendship is we think it happens by accident. A lot of stuff goes unsaid when actually it needs to be said. And there's those beautiful verses in John where Jesus talks about friendship and he says, everything the Father has made known to me, I've made known to you. And I think Jesus is so explicit about being vulnerable with friends. And if you're looking for one key word to how to deepen friendship in any setting, being really vulnerable with each other and asking really good questions. I think both those things will help us across the board, but especially when it comes to breaking down the barriers with people who are different from us.
Yeah, I think that vulnerability is so key. And as you said, if you feel like there's any conflict in a friendship as well, it's really good if you're close enough to that person to feel like you can actually name that and at an appropriate point as well. Thinking about friendships that we look up to, is there a friendship in the Bible that you look up to as kind of a gold standard of friendship, or anything that it kind of inspires you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the book is based around kind of Jesus and the disciples, and I just love the friendships that we see there. And I think especially around, we've talked about the circles, those inner circles of Peter, James and John. And again, it's really hard, isn't it? Because imagine being one of the nine. Imagine being kind of an Andrew, or I feel really sorry for James the Lesser. Can you imagine being James the Lesser, and James, the brother of John, gets invited to be with Jesus, but James the Lesser doesn't? So I think in some ways I wouldn't have liked to have been one of the nine, but I'd have loved to have been one of the three who Jesus, the Son of God, really shares his life with. And a couple of moments that I love where Jesus takes his disciples to the highest of the high in terms of the transfiguration, but also the lowest of the low in Gethsemane. And of course they let him down and they fall asleep and it's a bit of a disaster. But I think in terms of the kind of that gold standard of friendship, I mean, just imagine being taken right into every experience with the Son of God. And, it's fascinating, isn't it, that the Chosen at the moment has kind of depicted many of the moments of Jesus and the disciples. And non-Christians are watching the Chosen and going, wow, and even coming to faith as a result of watching it. But I think there's so much in the Gospels that we don't see. But imagine waking up every day as a disciple of Jesus and being called friend. That must have been an extraordinary journey.
Yeah, no, that must have been amazing. And I do love, The Chosen, where you kind of see Jesus's interaction with people and kind of his sense of humor, and how, of course, he just would have been a normal human being, just laughing with his friends at times, as well as sharing those kind of deeper moments as well. In terms of church, a single-friendly church, we work across all the denominations. We try and really be ecumenical, but I know that you work with a lot of evangelical churches. And one thing I've noticed about the evangelical church is they're very good and very big on the small group, which is a really great structure for making friends. And for those of you perhaps who are listening who are in a different denomination, small groups is perhaps a small group Bible study. Sometimes they're called cell groups, sometimes they're called community groups, but this is a place where you'd traditionally gather in someone's home. You might have a meal together, you'd read the Bible and you'd pray for each other. And these can be a really great way of forming community. But sometimes I wonder whether the church sometimes puts a little bit too much onus on these to be, that is the place where you find friendship.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's just assumed, hey, if you want to make friends in the church, just join a small group and everything will be okay. But sometimes that's not always the case. I just wondered if you had an opinion on that.
My experience of small groups, almost the opposite. Our small group was not necessarily the space where we formed the deepest of friendships, but it really was a place where we formed like really intergenerational connections. And at really key points of our lives, we interacted with people, and I think it was such, the diversity of friendship actually was really good in getting to know people, and almost like forces you together. So I talked about being at my best I kind of naturally gravitate and be intentional. Sometimes with small group, it's a choice to go. But when you're there, you really get to know people. And I think what small group is the antidote to the big church. So big church, really good for bringing sometimes hundreds together, really good for communicating big messages. I'm a preacher. I love going to big church, but it's not so good at those smaller spaces. But I think one thing that's really helpful is there's almost a kind of, we've just talked about vulnerability. There's almost a forced vulnerability in small groups, right? So I've never been to a small group where you haven't got to the end and then gone round and went, right, what can we pray for? And you do have a choice in that moment. You can choose to pray for your cat if you like, if you want to be, if you want to go enter at that level, or you can be really vulnerable and say, I am really struggling with this thing, this relationship, this pressure at work. And I think that almost kind of gives you a really great opportunity to open your heart to other people and gives the opportunity for people to pray with you. And I think also as Christians, the opportunity to pray with others also can be a really key moment of deepening relationship in quite a superficial world. But I will probably also say, on the other side, it's probably not enough, because I think people who are at small group know that you're there because you're kind of forced to be together. I think there's like another level you can go to then where you develop relationships, which might be then a coffee with someone who's at small group. And the small group might provide the kind of on-ramp to that friendship. I talk in the book about a friend of mine who talked about the second coffee, which I thought was a really helpful thing. We often have first coffees with people where we get to know them, but the kind of the follow-up to say, shall we do it again? I think it's almost like a kind of a milestone in a friendship. And I wonder whether for small groups, they're like the first coffee, but then there's like another coffee, which comes then where you kind of say to someone in small group, hey, you just talked about this film. Do you want to go and see it together? Or, you talked about this great place to eat. Should we go together? Would you like to come around to mine for some? I think that's like the next level of friendship. And there are certainly levels through which you go through in friendships. And the amount of time is like oxygen to friendship. Small group at most is like 2 hours a week. You're not going to be able to make great friends on that basis, but it might provide the on-ramp to a deeper friendship where you can have another coffee.
Yeah, absolutely. Where you spend more time and you kind of get more vulnerable and one-on-one. Yeah, that's
Right.
brilliant. Something that we love at Single Friendly Church is just this idea of spiritual family in the body of Christ. And there's one particular passage that we really love, which is in Matthew 12, when Jesus talks about spiritual family. And I'm going to read it out because I think it's just quite interesting. While Jesus was still talking to the crowd, his mother and brothers stood outside wanting to speak to him. Somebody told him, your mother and brothers are standing outside wanting to speak to you. He replied to him, who is my mother and who are my brothers? Pointing to his disciples, he said, here are my mother and brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. And we love this idea because it's that idea of perhaps if you don't have physical family, as church, you are really welcomed into this new spiritual family. And particularly if you're single and perhaps you're far away from your family, or you don't have a close family of your own, that can be really wonderful. And I know that friends are often talked about as chosen family. I just wondered if you've seen any good examples of where friends in church have really embraced this idea of spiritual family, because sometimes it can be a lovely idea, but in practice, what does that really look like?
Yeah, it's great, isn't it? And a really important verse for me is in Psalm 68. Which says, a father to the fatherless and defender of widows is God in his holy dwelling. And for me, kind of as someone who hasn't got a dad, that's been really key. But the next verse is amazing. It says he sets the lonely in families. Those two passages, yeah, gorgeous. Best example, and I think a key word for us here when it comes to kind of family and friendship together is extending the table. And so I guess in my own life, I do have a family, but we want to fight against the narrative of just having been doing too much in our own nuclear family. And so if I think about the kind of the last few years, what that's looked like is we're on a council estate in Birmingham, and there are lots of young people and children who have different experiences of family, but often actually will find their way into church. And, we've got people in their 20s and 30s actually who came to church just because there was something going on, a kind of youth group or boys brigade or whatever, and now have become followers of Jesus and are part of the church family. But at the kind of teenage end, there are lots of kind of teenagers turn up who have mixed bag when it comes to family and wouldn't necessarily even be used to kind of sitting around a table having a meal together. What we've always tried to do as a family is said, do you want to come around for lunch? And I preach in a different church almost every Sunday, Beth. And so what happens is I will often be away in the morning somewhere in the country, and I'll get home and I'm exhausted. And to some extent, what I want to do is cocoon myself in my own living room and watch the football and kind of shut everything else out. But we've often got people in our house who aren't our family, who have just been invited around by my kids or or my wife. And the temptation is to go, oh, I don't want to hang out with these people. But actually, it's important that we extend the table. And sometimes it's not just lunch they stay for, it's evening meal. And then it gets to bedtime and it's like, right, it's time to go home. And I think that for us has been a really important extension and a welcoming into a home. And in other situations as a family, we've kind of invited people on holiday who wouldn't normally have people to go on holiday with. I remember my parents were an amazing example of this. So when I was growing up, our Christmas table was very rarely our nuclear family. We would often have an old woman from down the street who didn't have anyone to spend Christmas with, or a kind of a family member, kind of a grandparent, or and sometimes at very late notice, we'd extend the table. And I think when it comes to chosen family, that hospitality piece, that extending the family up to whoever of whatever age, background, and story, is a really, really powerful model of what the church can be.
Yeah, that's great. And I love how you say that sometimes it's very last minute. And I think, we have to be open to the idea of, often these things aren't necessarily something that you can plan. Sometimes it's about seeing an immediate need and being like, you know what, maybe I'm the person who can respond to that need. Maybe this is the moment for me to extend an arm of friendship and pull someone a bit closer. Yeah,
Jesus was interrupted an awful lot, wasn't he? Reading the Gospels so often, he's on his way to somewhere and someone interrupts him. And I think we would often go, do you know what? I'm on my way. I've got an appointment in the diary. I can't possibly stop. We're so guilty of that. And I think the kind of interruptibleness of people, we've got a lot to learn, I think, there. And sometimes we can't plan for those spontaneous moments that sometimes develop key friendships, especially where people need us, but actually we find a real mutuality in the blessing of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, busyness is, as we said earlier, is one of those big barriers to kind of making friends. I mean, what would you say if someone's, is really busy with very good things? It's very rarely we're busy with bad things. Often we'll fill our lives with lots of really good things. And sometimes it finds that we don't have enough time to invest in our friendship. What would you say to someone if perhaps, you feel like they could have more margin for friendship? It's not like they're doing anything wrong. They're just busy.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think what I'd say is whatever you're doing to fill your life with, to the exclusion of friendship, whatever that thing is, friendship is better for you than that thing. and it's not just better for you, it's better for the other person. And I think I'd say if we feel we're in friendship recession and deficit as individuals, give the gift of friendship to someone. And when we do, we are both a blessing and we are blessed ourselves. So I know Sheridan might have talked about this on his moment with you, but friendship is so good for us. It decreases our anxiety and depression. It increases meaning and happiness. It boosts our immune system. It provides a safeguard against addictions. It increases our threshold for pain and can even extend our lifespans by 7 years. If you can find something in your life that's replacing friendship that does all those things, then do those things. But friendship is just so good for us. I think the line in my book that I write is that the sages, the scientists, the sociologists, and the scriptures all agree it's not good for us to be alone. I think the other thing I would say is I think we also have more time than we think. So I don't know about you, Beth, but for me, I get this notification on a Monday morning on my phone, which tells me how much I've spent on my phone in that last week. And it's embarrassing every single Monday morning. And if I were to, the problem is now our phones tell us how long we've been on Instagram and Facebook and those things. If I spent a fraction of the amount of time in those spaces with friends, my friendships would be a lot better. And like everybody else, even though I've written the book on it, I'm still a work in progress. And do you know what the worst thing is about writing the book on it? Loads of people hold it against me and say, you should be a really good friend. And it's a terrible thing to do. So never write a book on friendship is the last advice.
Oh, I think it's a lifelong journey, isn't it? Just we're on it. We're a lifelong apprentices in learning how to be good friends.
And followers of Jesus. Yeah.
Absolutely. So to finish, I just wondered if you had a Bible passage or a Bible story related to friendship that's particularly struck you, that you'd like to share with people just to close us out.
Yes, I've got a strange one to finish with, and that is Jesus at the cross. So this was a bit of a surprise to me when I was investigating friendship. But one of the things that I became aware of as I looked into the kind of dynamics of how friends are made, I became aware of what I describe as a really annoying superpower, that some people just are incredible at making friends. They just sneeze and they have a load of really close friends. And it just annoyed me. And so I began to look into some of the science of it. And it seems that you might call it a gift or a trained ability or whatever. Some people are what's called connectors. Sociologists recognize they're just these people who are just brilliant at connecting people. And not only are they good at making friends, they're also really good at connecting other people. So I've got, for example, a friend called Andy. And I know a lot of my current friends through my friend Andy. Andy's kind of said, "Oh, Phil, you really need to meet this person." And as I'm saying this, I reckon there are some people who are listening, they go, "Oh, I've got a friend like that. They've introduced me to a load of other people too." Well, here's the deal. If you want to make good friends, one of the really good things you can do is get to know the Andys of this world, because they'll be good at introducing you to other people. That's the first thing. But then I kind of became aware of this idea that I think of all the connectors we know as Christians, the greatest connector is God. And I kind of thought about the friends that I have, a bit like Sheridan, who you've had on this podcast. I think it was God who brought us together. And I think sometimes there are people who I like to kind of picture this scene in heaven. This isn't very good theology, but I like to picture it, of kind of God saying to kind of the angels, you know, there's this moment where Beth is going to meet this friend Sarah, and what's going to happen is they're going to connect and they're going to be great friends. And you watch, here we go, 3, 2, 1. This is their first handshake. Way, you know, I don't think that necessarily happens, but I think the idea of it is true. That kind of God loves it when we connect with people, and those friendships then go on to fulfill our friends. Anyway, back to Jesus at the cross. Jesus Christ is dying for the sins of the world in physical agony. Separation. He's about to be separated from his father for the only time in the history of the world. At that moment, he sees at the foot of the cross his disciple John, who's his really close friend, and his mother. And he says to his disciple, "Here is your mother." And he says to his mother, "Here is your son." And he makes a connection, the great connector, at that moment. And I think that it's almost like an underestimated kind of phenomenon that we don't realise when it comes to friendship. And so what I encourage us to do is, if we feel like we've been listening to this, first of all, if you're struggling with friendship, you are not alone. Loads of us, 51% of us, struggle to make new friends. This is a really common phenomenon in our world. But what I would say is, don't just pray for the friends you have, pray for the friends you need in this season, and pray for others to have the friends that they need. And when you're about to go into a room of people that you might not say to the Lord, "God, would you help me in this moment?" I still do that. I know I come across as really extroverted. I'm actually quite introverted. And sometimes when I go into big rooms of people, I'm like, "Oh, Lord, would you please help me make connections with people today?" And especially if you're single, you may be going to church for the first time, that's a really good prayer to pray. When you're kind of going to church, maybe you've been going for a while, and actually you dread the moment when the church leader prays at the end or the last song's played, because you're like, who am I going to connect with? Just saying a little prayer in that moment, saying, "Lord, would you just please help me connect?" Because if Jesus at the cross has the presence of mind to connect a mother and a son, I think he cares enough for us in this moment to connect us to the friends we need in whatever season we're in. And that's why that's one of my favourite stories when it comes to friendship.
Oh, that's amazing. Thanks so much, Phil. It feels so encouraging and also just so practical. And I'm sure that anyone listening today who might be feeling a bit lonely in church, that is something really practical that they can do and they can lean into just in that moment, which is great. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast and for giving us your time. I encourage anyone who wants to find out more about friendship to read Phil's book. It's called The Best of Friends, and you can find it in many bookstores, or you can find it online as well. But thank you so much, Phil, for joining us today.
Thank you too. Just love being part of the conversation. Love what you guys do. It's such brilliant work. And thank you also for highlighting friendship. It's a really, really important thing to be looking at. So thanks so much.
If you've enjoyed this conversation, make sure that you follow us on social media. We're just at Single Friendly Church. We've got lots of resources on our website, and we'll be continuing this conversation about friendship on there. And do subscribe to the podcast as well, where you can get future episodes about friendship and other things single friendly related. Thanks for listening.